I'm James Turk. I'm a director of the Gold Money Foundation, and I'm pleased to be here today with noted historian, former member of the European Parliament, and author of 5 books, including this one, When Money Dies: The Nightmare of the Deficit Spending, Devaluation, and Hyperinflation of Weimar Germany. Adam Fergusson, it's a pleasure to be with you here today.
Nice to have you here.
So Adam, in your book, it is clear that the underlying cause of great hyperinflation was that at the time central bankers and government officials didn't connect the dots between money printing and inflation. In the current crisis with the quantitative easings and competitive currency devaluation, do you think central bankers are at risk of making the same mistake?
Central bankers, without exception, all understand monetary theory. The fact that they ignore what they know is, for political or economic or other purposes, is beside the point. They know what causes inflation, they know what causes devaluation and depreciation of the currency. Sometimes it is seen to be politically necessary to do what all common sense tells you should not be done.
Since 2007, the spending of the United States on wars and social programs seems to have broken free of the realities of finance. Do you see the parallels?
I think that's stretching it quite a long way. In Germany in 1914, hoped to win a quick war. They hoped it would be over by Christmas, and that they would be able to pay for it by what they seized from the Allied treasuries when they'd won it. This is not the same kind of condition at all. The wars that the West, America, NATO has been fighting have all been for very different purposes with very different objectives than from what Germany was seeking in those days. And the financing of the war, well, the Germans simply didn't bother to think out how that war should be financed. They didn't think it would arise.
But isn't that a parallel with the present situation? Are governments today really thinking the consequences of the deficit spending that they're pursuing to finance wars and social programs?
I suppose that's so. You could certainly argue it, but national defense is often thought to be the most important thing for many people. And whether you think a war here or there across the world is in the national defense is another matter. But national defense is something that from throughout history, people have always put right at the top of the national necessities.
When you wrote Money Dies in 1975, the world was in the grip of inflation at double digits or approaching double digits.
Yeah, it was, yes.
Yeah. Do you see a similar occurrence of inflation? Do you see inflation occurring again in the future as a consequence of the policies that are being pursued?
Oh, yes, I do. I see it getting worse and worse. The question is how bad it's going to be. If you're looking again back on Germany, I don't think it's possible to have in an advanced Western economy hyperinflation of the kind that was achieved there mainly through monetary ignorance. But inflation, if you start inflating your economy, you're playing with fire always, and it can get out of hand. And to that extent, the parallel again is certainly there.
Do you sense that inflation is starting to get out of hand, given all of the quantitative easing that central banks around the world are pursuing to finance these seemingly never-ending government deficits?
I think the position is, of course, terribly serious right through, again, the Western economies. I don't see that any of these economies is going to be able to grow its way out of the extraordinary debts that they have. The logic of that, if you can't grow your way out of your debt, you have to repudiate that debt. And there is only one serious way of repudiating debt, and that's by inflating. It's what a government can do, and possibly what the only thing it can do eventually, if those debts have to be met. You just get rid of them.
You know, going back to the Weimar Republic, hyperinflation in Germany, what I'd like to do is, again, just sort of emphasize what we can learn from history. I'm a firm believer in the dictum of the American philosopher George Santayana that if we ignore history, we're doomed to relive it. And I think the period of the hyperinflation is definitely an area that we want to avoid. But looking back at that Weimar experience, who were the people who benefited from that inflation? Government obviously benefited because they repaid their debts for next to nothing.
Not only government, but if you had a mortgage, your mortgage was paid off because you could pay it off in postage stamps. If you were a speculator, you could borrow cheaply. The Reichsbank was prepared to give almost limitless credit to anybody who wanted to set up a factory or export or anything like that, because there was such fear of unemployment. That's another parallel today. In the nation as a whole, at a time when revolution was, of course, in the air, they couldn't stand the idea of mass unemployment, and so they gave endless credit. And the answer was that anyone who got hold of that credit could export cheaply, using cheap labor at home, because the price of labor was coming down all the time. And so you got profiteering and speculation on a very, very big scale. The effect of that was to bring a lot of foreign exchange into the country, and the people who used that were again the industrialists and profiteers who were building up their empires all the time. The people who were losing, naturally, were the people who depended on shares and bonds and everything else. Anyone who'd saved any money, all that money disappeared. The other people who did well, it's an extraordinary thing how, and you can see it again now, inflation develops its own lobby, supporting lobby. There are people who, as in Germany, people tried to persuade the government to go on inflating, to go on printing money, because they were making so much out of it. Nowadays, people who benefit are the hedge fund managers, all the people across the world who are making a lot of money out of the wild fluctuations in the value of currencies all across the world. These are people who benefit.
So the creditors benefited, and the savers and people who had financial assets denominated in Reichsmarks, which was the currency at the time, they were the losers.
They were losing all the time. Anybody who had a fixed income, a pensioner, they would lose. The only people who gained, no, that's the wrong word. The people who were able to keep up with inflation for a long time was anybody who had any kind of grip on the public finances. That is to say, if you were in a trade union, you could strike for higher wages. Say a public trade union. If you were in the railways and the post office, that sort of thing, you could strike, and the government would simply print more money. You could keep up. But if you were a pensioner or someone like a professor or an architect or a lawyer who the demand for whose services was not very high when in times of high inflation, your income would simply disappear, and you would, instead of making money out of other people, you would find yourself breaking rocks on the riverside.
How did the German banks fare in the hyperinflation? Were they winners or losers?
The German banks, I think they came out of it. I mean, they still existed afterwards. The German banking system is highly complicated. It was then, and I think still is, because there were so many state banks and Landesbanks and so on. And many of them were issuing their own currency as well, while the central bank was issuing these huge amounts of money, getting with bigger and bigger denominations. There was never enough to go around, and local banks, just as local companies, were issuing money as well. It's a good question. I'm not quite certain what the answer is, but they survived. I think bankers always survive, and that's one of the sinister things about some bankers.
They knew what the monetary problems were, and therefore were able to position themselves to take advantage of it.
Equally, some, as we know now, as still happens, go spectacularly bust. But that's, again...
Absent the inflation, do you see any way that governments today can repay their huge debt loads?
I personally can't. We're talking about a selected number of governments. Germany will be all right. America, I think, will not. These Mediterranean countries, I think, will not. And I don't see really inflation as there being any other obvious way out. It is interesting the way the expression what keeps on mute, people are going kicking the can down the road and not facing the facts. And indeed, one goes on hoping that there will be some kind of solution will come out of will be found in the back of the cupboard, but there's no sign of it. And in European terms, the thought is always that first you can try issuing central bank bonds, which will be backed by everybody, but the Germans won't have it. The other possibility is that Europe becomes much closer fiscally, so that it works as one great United States of Europe. People don't want that. It may be the only way out, but if they won't have it, and I think even that would only be a reach-me-down kind of solution, because Germany will end up by carrying whatever has to be carried. Eventually, inflation will be the answer. It may be quite a good answer. I mean, one or two countries will default, but thereafter, stability, as in Germany again, will be attained eventually by a default and starting again.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the implications of hyperinflations and, as individuals, what you can do about it to protect yourself. In 1991, I traveled down to Argentina because my sense of it was that the austral, which was the currency at the time, was about to hyperinflate.
Yep.
They had broke the link to the US dollar, 14 australs to $1 US in January of 1991. I arrived in early May, and the devaluation had already been quite severe. There were 64 australs to $1 US. When I left a week later, it had gone up to 96 australs, and by December it was 10,000 australs to $1 US. And I remember very vividly, talking to shopkeepers, particularly the concern, because they had gone through hyperinflations before and knew what they needed to do to protect themselves, but were obviously very, very worried about what they saw coming. I'd like to talk, though, a little bit about hyperinflation and, in Germany, and, what were the social consequences of that hyperinflation?
They were horrendous, I would say. You had a whole class of people, the rentier classes, the people who had savings, they were ruined. You had the professional classes unable to make any money at all. We're talking about over 3 years. You had the outbreak of crime, of corruption, and Germany had never been a corrupt country before. You had political riots all over the place, food riots, employment riots, unemployment riots. You had Hitler down in Bavaria stirring people up, saying that everything is the fault of the Jews. And there was a total social breakdown. You also had the effect of seeing people swarming in from outside, after all the war was over for 3 years, spending their money, spending foreign exchange, and be able to buy all kinds of things from everybody. You were reduced eventually to a barter economy, so that unless you had foreign exchange, you couldn't even buy food. Country was divided against town, because in the countryside there was still lots of food, but they wouldn't sell the food to the towns because they didn't want worthless paper in return. So you had class against class. You had people, your friends. You always suspected your friends were doing rather better than you were at any time, and you were suspicious of people who appeared to be able to work the system. Everybody was gambling on it who had any money, gambled on the stock exchange, because all the time people were thinking of the price of the dollar. Everything was dollars.
Well, they talked about dollars, but the dollar was still tied to gold, of course, so really that was a substitute for gold.
That's fair enough. But I mean, the point about that, everyone thought the dollar was going up all the time. But in fact, it was that the mark was going up against the dollar. My God, it's now at 1 million, it's now at 2 million, it's now 1,000 million, and so on. But in fact, it looked as if the mark was going up, but in fact the mark was going down. The dollar was very largely retaining its value. As you say, it was in gold, and the gold. The Germans had a very strange approach to all this. They always said a gold mark equals a mark, and even the president of the Reichsbank, Dr. Havenstein, spoke of things getting back to normal, where he thought the mark would once again be worth a gold mark. They never sort of lost this idea, and in fact, at the very, very end of the inflation, when the old mark disappeared and they brought in the Renton mark, when the old mark was worth a millionth of what it formerly was, they achieved the idea that a mark equaled a mark simply by knocking off 12 zeros from the mark denominated in that way, so that they hung on to gold right to the end as being what mattered, and indeed all the reparations paid by Germany to the Allies, especially to the French and the Germans, reparations for the war, they had to be paid in gold marks or in materials worth with a gold mark value. So gold remained at all times in Germany the measure of what was important to them.
The numeraire for standard of value.
Yeah.
When I was in Argentina in 1991, I only stayed in the city. I didn't go to the countryside, but I got a sense from talking to people in the city that people in the country were much better off. Was that true in Germany?
Yes. And in fact, they were better off, because a lot of people in the country held mortgages which had been eliminated by the collapse of the value of the mark. They could pay off their mortgages as I say, in postage stamps. The real trouble was being a creditor. Remember the Polonius's advice to Ophelia in Hamlet: "Never a borrower nor a lender be." But he could have added, in inflation, if you were going to be a borrower or lender, for God's sake, be a borrower, because the more you borrowed, the less you had to pay back. And that, of course, is true. I mean, if a central bank has a 2% inflation target, well, that's 2% of robbery. I mean, anyone who has money, whether it's the Chinese or the saver living in her flat at the top of some building in wherever, they are being robbed all the time. And unless you have some kind of specie or share which is index linked, is going to keep its value, and they didn't have that sort of thing in Germany at the time, the debts that you have are being repudiated.
Was there any attempt after the hyperinflation that contracts that were paid at pennies on the mark after the hyperinflation, to rewrite those contracts so that they had to be repaid in a sound currency?
No, there was some of the government bonds were repaid at sort of 4 or 5%. I mean, not 100%. There was a certain amount of that, and simply because in the course of the hyperinflation, or rather the pre-hyperinflation times, 1921, 22, when it took off, they began to issue bonds and various instruments which were guaranteed in some sort of way against the future. But the guarantees weren't worth very much. The answer is no. Broadly speaking, no, I think.
The reason why I'm asking that question is I don't want to give viewers of this video the impression that borrowing during a period of inflation is a one-way street. Because I like to use the example of Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States. He paid the debts on his father-in-law's estate just shortly before the War of Independence broke out, and it placed the currency with the state government during the period of war in Virginia. with the money to be then paid after the war. But while the money was sitting there, it basically was debased to nothing. And after the war, the courts ruled that he had to repay that debt again in hard currency, which, of course, was the British pound. So he ended up having to pay that debt twice. There was no effort like that in Germany to force creditors to repay in terms of what they actually borrowed.
No, all the pressure was coming from the Allies, from France, the Reparations Commission. The winners, I told you, were the speculators, the industrialists who were building, who got endless credit, built factories, were able to export using low wages at home, and making a huge amount of money in foreign exchange. So that, and they were, for a time, the winners. When the inflation was over, they found themselves unable to cope with all these empty factories, which nobody wanted to use.
Because the economy had been destroyed by the hyperinflation. It had
been totally destroyed.
Yeah.
It was astonishing how quickly, after the final default, after everyone was ruined, after the money had died, after the mark was worthless, how quickly it was possible to build the economy again from base. Many people had been ruined, and they had to start again as well. And it was helped by the Dawes Plan, which, rather like the Marshall Plan after the Second World War, America came to Germany's rescue. And it again, Germany had to default on a lot of its reparations obligations. It simply couldn't afford to pay. Incidentally, interestingly, the German reparations for the First World War were finally paid last April. Hitler suspended the payment of the reparation obligations. When after the war, it was decided that the reparations payments would not continue until Germany was reunited. When it was reunited, they started again, and that's why they've finally been paid off. But that's a
historical fact.
Footnote.
Yeah, exactly. Again, in terms of having people protect themselves, we talked about foreign exchange, which obviously meant gold. Tangible assets, was that another way that they were able to protect themselves?
I mean, this business of havens, which we see so much nowadays, was very much in vogue. First, you tried to get foreign currency. And the best ones to hold were the Swiss franc, the guilder, the two neutrals, and dollars, and to some extent sterling. So you went for those if you could. Failing that, you got rid of your money. This is talking about 1923, when inflation was becoming so extraordinary. You simply took your money, bought a share if you could, because the stock exchange was still working very well, or you converted it into a grand piano, whatever you could persuade anyone else who was desperate for money to part with. And you're always looking for that. There was a problem with housing. The Germans have never wanted to own houses very much. They've always tended to rent them. And the landowners, the landlords, were in a very bad way, because there had been a law had been passed early in the war controlling rents, holding at pre-war value. So if you happened to have an apartment and you rented it, you went on doing that extremely cheaply. But in the meantime, your landlord or landlady was in penury.
So visible wealth was visible, tangible assets were not necessarily.
I mean, it was quite a good thing to own a block of apartments, but it wasn't doing much good until much later on, when you could sell it again.
Yeah. Can you discuss a little bit what ultimately brought the hyperinflation to an end?
Yes. When the mark, by September 1923, when the mark, I think, was worth, when the dollar, I should say, was worth about 100 million marks, no one was taking it anymore. Various attempts had been made to to think of some new currency that people would accept. There was still just enough gold in Germany to back a new currency. although that gold was spilling out all the time towards the Allies in reparations. And eventually, when on the same day that Dr. Havenstein died in November 1923, he was succeeded by Dr. Schacht, who eventually became Hitler's banker. And he brought in this new note called the Rentenmark. The Reichsmark, the mark disappeared. The Rentenmark was brought in, and it was based not on gold, of which there by that time wasn't really enough. It was based on the notional value of land, which incidentally was the same as the assignat of the French Revolution in the 1790s. It meant nothing. People couldn't take a Rentenmark and go and buy a bit of land with it. But because people were in such despair, they were prepared to believe in this new currency. It was the important thing about the Schacht reforms was that the Reichsbank stopped discounting treasury notes. And so inflation stopped just like that, with an astonishing speed. And the Rentenmark, which went on for another, I don't know, I think it was about 12 months before the Reichsmark, which was the new currency, could be brought in. So it went Mark, Rentenmark, Reichsmark. After the Second World War, it became the Deutschmark, but that's another story. Now, the effect of having the Rentenmark and a currency everyone believed in was very remarkable. In the first place, because people believed in it, and the food started flowing from the country into the town again. The farmers were prepared to accept the Rentenmark in exchange for the food. The problem in the towns was that nobody could afford to pay for it because they'd lost all their money. But at least this was a basis on which something could be done. It had another effect, that all the revolutionary movements were moving around, that were taking place in Germany at the time, and Hitler's beer cellar putsch, which had happened in early November. This was just one of the things that were terrifying everybody. There had been revolution in Russia, you see, a few years before. And all these, with the introduction of the Rentenmark and the end of the mark, all these political movements, left or right, ceased to trouble. It was again an extraordinary thing. It was at that point then something began to grow again. Unemployment again got much worse. But within 2 years, a German economy was being reconstructed and working.
So if the central bank stopped discounting or monetizing government debt, there was a dramatic cutback in government spending then as well, under the Rentenmark?
A lot of the unemployment, of course, that broke out then was, say, the railways being put in order. They were, as in Austria, about 2 or 3 times as many people as ought to be running the railways were running the railways. The post office again had twice as many operatives as ought to be in there. This was the sort of thing that they were able to sort out, and that's why you got a lot of unemployment. On the other hand, people began to believe that Germany was worth trading with once again. She escaped, for the time, a lot of the reparations payment which had ruined her. And things very slowly came back to normal. I repeat again, a lot of people were ruined. And and what was perhaps more terrible was that democracy had got a very bad name in Germany, which was one of the reasons why 10 years later it was possible for a demagogue to take over. But that was via the problems of the Great Depression.
In your epilogue to the book, you say to the German people, quote, democracy and republicanism had become so associated with financial, social, and political disorder as to render any alternatives preferable when disorder threatened again. So that helped.
I think that puts it rather well.
Yeah, that helped facilitate the rise of Hitler.
Yes.
because he promised order when there was none.
Exactly.
Is that the lesson of history?
The lesson of history is never don't go there in the first place. I think I absolutely take. If you're saying what I'm saying is that if you debauch your currency, you're asking for trouble. I think I make the mark in the book again. I quote, I think it's Lenin, saying if you want to, the way to ruin a country is to ruin its country, debauch the country and debauch its currency. Therefore, every central bank, to my mind, and every central government ought to regard the keeping the value, simply keeping the currency something you can trust in. Yeah. It's the loss of trust that's so awful.
But you say the lesson of history is never to go there in the first place, but also in your epilogue you say what really broke Germany, and this is a quote, what really broke Germany was the constant taking of the softer political option in respect of money.
Well, that is what's going on now, isn't it?
So is that the lesson from history?
Yes,
that we should prepare ourselves for perhaps a coming hyperinflation?
Can it be stopped? What is hyperinflation? What is going to cause it? It's caused by the loss of trust by people in their money, the cowardice of governments who don't say, right, this is stopping now, and then if people lose trust in their currency, then they start to get rid of it. It's interesting. They start by saving it when the first thing they hold on to it, causing a depression. Then after a bit they don't trust it, they get rid of it as fast as they can. And then you get $100 doing the work of $10. $100 doing the work of $1,000.
Yeah, money is not just...
the velocity gets quicker and quicker, and
yes.
Then governments lose control. At that point, you may find yourself moving into hyperinflation. Certainly very high inflation.
Yeah, it's not just a function of supply, it's also a function of demand. And at a certain point, a tipping point will be reached where confidence is lost and people lose demand. The demand for that currency goes down and they spend it.
That's right. But what is not clear is at what point does people's confidence in their currency disappear? I mean, is it at an inflation rate of 5%, 7%, 10%, 100%? It's not clear. In Germany, it's amazing how the confidence, belief in the mark, it went on right through the war and didn't really collapse until it had reached sort of, you've suddenly got 20% inflation, that sort of thing. But people are so unpredictable that...
well, you can't predict these things, but
economists, all you economists try to predict things, and they do, and they fail again and again and again.
No one can predict the future in terms of the timing, but when you're on a road heading toward a cliff, eventually you're going to get to the end of that cliff. And that's not a prediction, it's just an inevitability. But there's just one other thing in terms of the lessons of history that, to wrap up. Also from your epilogue, you say, quote, there came a stage when it was politically impossible to halt inflation. Have we seen that also now in the West?
Not quite, but we're getting near that situation. If inflation is the only way out of government debt, as it is in the Western nations, then it's going to happen. And the question is, how much? And once you don't even know how much, how are you going to stop it? I don't want to predict hyperinflation. I do predict high inflation, and I hope it can be stopped. And it may need the kind of courage that politicians cannot have. Monsieur Juncker, who is the Luxembourg finance minister, or I'm not certain what he has now, he said something so wise. He said, we all know what has to be done. What we don't know is how to get re-elected once we've done it. And there's an awful lot of truth in that.
Adam Fergusson, author of When Money Dies, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you, James.